Today on the Crackin Backs Podcast, we sit down with a man on a mission, Sumit Rai, the founder of Cancer Check Labs. After losing his only sibling to cancer, Sumit didn't just grieve, he transformed. From Wall Street to the front lines of medical innovation, he is now the leading charge on a groundbreaking blood test that can detect cancer at stage 0 before a tumor even really develops. We're talking about the future of cancer care. This is a screening that could become as routine as a cholesterol check and a sci-fi sounding device that may one day filter cancer cells from the bloodstream. But how do we balance knowledge with fear, trust with technology, and what does it mean to truly catch cancer early enough to save lives? Stay tuned because you won't want to miss this one. Well, Mr. Sumit Rai, it is very good to have you on the show. I look forward to some of our conversation, and I would love to start with asking you about your history of over 20 years as a venture capital and a hedge fund. But I know this life journey became deeply personal for you back in 2012. So with that said, I understand you lost an only sibling to cancer and essentially dedicated your life to finding out a cure. How did losing that sister change your perspective on life and set you on a path of founding the Cancer Check Labs?
Sure. I mean, the first kind of half of my career that you alluded to, when you go into venture capital and, private equity, hedge funds, those sorts of things, you're really in there to make money, largely. I mean, that's really what your focus is. And, despite what people talk about, even with ESG, which is, sort of environmental, social good investing, the reality is those funds are there to make money for their fund investors. And that's what you're focused on. I think when you have an experience like I did, unfortunately, and you suffer these types of unbearable losses, you change. You start to think that, you don't want anyone else to ever go through that type of pain, that type of trauma, and that type of an unbearable loss. And you become much more mission-oriented, much more impact-oriented. You start thinking a lot more about humanitarian things, philanthropy. And that's what triggered me to go forward and learn so much about cancer to try to come up with a solution that could really move the needle for other people's outcomes so no one has to go through what I went through, what my family went through.
Yeah, very good. Now, we understand, we look at a little bit of recent history and how the pandemic changed how we view healthcare and technology. There's an issue of trust and understanding about how science has changed, especially with rapid vaccine development, the rise of telehealth, but also a lot of the public skepticism on a lot of the infodemic issues that came up. From your perspective, though, how has that impacted the way people view health tech, like early cancer screening? I'm sure there's some skepticism out there, and this post-pandemic mindset made it easier or harder for you to build trust in that high-tech blood test for cancer.
Well, I think the healthcare industry in general is very slow-moving, right? It just takes a long time, and I think what that's resulted in healthcare specifically is sort of two factions and a rising faction. And you have sort of traditional healthcare today, and in traditional healthcare, you're talking about normal primary care, sometimes concierge medicine, which is effectively glorified primary care, where you end up paying some type of large subscription fee, $10,000 a year, so the practitioner will spend 40 minutes with you instead of 4. But all of that is traditional allopathic medicine. And what that means is it's reactive. You have to have a disease, a condition, or a symptom. Until then, they're really not going to do anything. And so what that's resulted in is the rise of sort of this area called functional medicine, sometimes called longevity, sometimes anti-aging, sometimes regenerative. But this whole group of sort of functional medicine practitioners today are very much about preventative, preemptive medicine. So it ends up becoming largely a cash pay market because insurance doesn't really do anything until you have a disease, condition, or symptom, again, in traditional allopathic care. But the reality is you should be trying to prevent disease, not trying to always cure it. I mean, if you have something, obviously cure it, but the reality is you don't want to get to that point. You want to try to prevent it as much as possible. And that's why you're seeing the rise of functional medicine, clinics that do health optimization, blood panels that are more extensive, looking for different markers and signals that something may be wrong or on its way to becoming wrong, so you can intervene earlier. And it's growing rapidly. I mean, just to put it in perspective, if you were to think about, these are again high income demographics because they're cash pay, generally speaking. But if you think about concierge medicine in the United States, you have 13,000 practices in the US. If you think about functional medicine in the US, which is maybe 10, 15 years old, you have 40,000 practices. It outsizes it by 3 times and is growing rapidly around the globe as well. It's not just a US thing. And so I think, go ahead.
I got a quick question for you. I'm going to go back to something. You mentioned hedge fund, it's all about making money. And now you got into more of the heart, right? Well, cancer has always been about making money. It seems like all the research, all the treatment, it's all been about making money. And it never seems like there's never seems like it's been a cure. There's billions and trillions of dollars that have been dumped into cancer research, yet I feel like we're in the same boat we were 20 years ago. How is that wave hard to navigate?
So, look, I mean, a lot of cancer historically has been about, and still is about, making money. I mean, chemo is about making money. Surgeries are about making money. Radiation ablation is about making money. Hospitalizations are about making money. And so imaging is about making money. I mean, all of this stuff is about making money. I mean, they're businesses. I think what it really comes down to is, who are the innovators? And so, the businesses, I mean, even our company ultimately will make money. I mean, but it's, what's your motive? Is your motive to get into it to become, financially wealthy and make a bunch of money? Or is your motive to try to have an impact and move the needle and change outcomes? I mean, to that end, in the cancer world, I'll just speak personally, my motive is impact. My motive is not financial. I didn't decide from my history, where I was a technology, venture capital, private equity guy and a tech entrepreneur in Silicon Valley that built, one of the largest marketplaces for mobile advertising and iPhone and Android apps, that suddenly I have this great idea where I'm going to make a lot of money and I'm going to go figure out, a cure to cancer. Like, it's just such a dramatic shift. You would never make that shift naturally if your motive was to make money. You go down the path that and you go down the path where you already have a lot of domain expertise, you would never even try something like this. And so it has to be driven by something very personal. And to that end, for me specifically, I run 2 nonprofits as well in cancer. You try to give back that money. I run 2 501c3s, the first of which I founded 13 years ago in 2012 when my sister passed away. And that's called Cure Sonia. That's a federal 501c3. My sister's name was Sonia. And in that one, we fund cancer research to look for better therapies and better solutions. We fund cancer research at Stanford, MD Anderson, USC, City of Hope. We do financial assistance for underprivileged families that cannot pay for their cancer care because it is so expensive, because it's a money-making business. I am one of the largest registrars of bone marrow donors in the world. I've registered over 10,000 people in 300 drives across 60 cities. I know for a fact that several of those registrations have resulted in bone marrow transplants that have saved several lives. And so, I was nominated for the National Board of LLS and Leukemia Lymphoma Society for my contributions to combating cancer. So yes, while these things will ultimately make money because that's how this system is set up, I think a lot of it also comes back to, do you want to give it back? To that end, we started our second nonprofit last year. I started another 501c3 called Save a Firefighter because where we're looking to essentially screen all the firefighters in the country. Because unfortunately, they have up to 3 times the incidence of cancer as the general population due to the hazardous exposure that they endure as first responders. Firefighters don't die from fires and collapsing buildings generally. They die from cancer. It's 74% line of duty death. It's 3 out of 4. It's a staggering number. And so, when you start thinking about those things, yes, these businesses are going to make money at the end of the day, but A, why are you doing it? What's your purpose? Why did you get into it? Are you doing it for impact? Are you doing it to help? Or are you doing it to make money? And B, if you do make a lot of money, how can you give that back to help people?
Love it. Do you have a strategy that helps doctors and public become more comfortable with such new innovation?
Yes, but it's a complex strategy because it depends which doctor, what channel. The way that a functional medicine practitioner, for example, will look at things, who is looking for things that are early, preventative, early signals, is different than how perhaps a traditional practitioner will look at it. One of the issues in sort of traditional medicine is it's very programmed today. Like, if you walk into a primary care practice today, the doctors don't do a lot of medicine anymore. They listen to you, they take your symptoms, they take your name, your body weight, they punch it into a computer that's got all kinds of algorithms, which punches out what may be wrong with you and punches out what prescription they should probably give you. The thought is kind of gone largely in much of primary care. It's become very automated. And to that end, in medicine, and this is necessary to some extent, there are protocols. You need protocols because you need things that work, but they get so programmed into those boxes in those protocols, they can't get outside of it. They're too accustomed and too programmed just following this rule set that they've been taught. And the thing is, when you have new technologies and new solutions come in, sometimes you need them to kind of get outside of that a little bit and start to think about it so they can have a little bit of thought leadership and start to expand the tools available to them as medical practitioners. There's also this concept that, look, there's a gap between science and medicine. Science is always ahead of medicine. And so what ends up happening is you figure things out in science and you figure things out that look promising and potentially work, but until you go and run very, very large trials, present them to the right regulatory bodies, present them to the right, bodies and associations, the right thought leaders in the medical community, adoption of that takes time. And so there are many things out there that are understood to be helpful in the scientific world that just take years, unfortunately, to make it into mainstream medicine because of how these pathways are set up, which have a lot of friction, a lot of hurdles, and a lot of barriers, some of which are financial, some of which are political, and there's all kinds of issues there.
We probably should have mentioned in the very beginning, could you describe this early cancer detection protocol that you are introducing to the world?
Sure. So, to understand it well, just a little background on cancer. If you have a solid tumor, and a solid tumor means lung cancer, breast, colorectal, pancreatic, ovarian, uterine, cervical, esophageal, gastric, stomach, brain, skin, thyroid, adrenal, all the organ tumors from which 100 million people a year suffer across the globe annually. The primary tumor itself, that lump, generally does not kill you. And this is what a lot of people don't understand. What kills you is that tumor sheds tumor cells that circulate through your bloodstream that are known as circulating tumor cells, or CTCs, the acronym for short. And the CTCs, the circulating tumor cells, spread the cancer in your body in a process known as metastasis, and the metastatic effects make your other biological organs dysfunctional, shut down, and you die. That's really how you die from cancer. You generally don't die from this lump. Now, a lot is known about CTCs, right? They have been extensively and exhaustively studied over the past 30 years, and we can talk more about that. But very basic things are CTCs are known to be the drivers of metastasis, the spread of cancer in the body. So when cancer is staged, when it goes from stage 0 to stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4, the process by which cancer progresses is spread, is metastasis, which is driven by these CTCs being shed from the tumor. And so you can't go from stage 0 to stage 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4 without CTCs being shed out into the bloodstream, which means they begin shedding, and they're known to begin shedding very early in a tumor's life, as early as stage 0, because that's what they need to do to get to stage 1, 2, 3, 4. So there are millions and millions of CTCs floating around your blood when a tumor is born. And so what we do, and what we did over the last 15 years, was develop a technology that allows us to extract these CTCs from a blood sample, whole and intact, such that we could take them and physically place them on a glass slide like tissue, like cellular tissue, because that's what it is. You could stain it just like tissue because it is tissue. You can put it in the palm of a pathologist to examine under a microscope, just like a tissue biopsy, because again, it is cellular tissue, it's whole intact tissue. And output a tissue biopsy report, a board certified pathology report. So what we do is we take a blood sample, we process it in our lab, we leverage this technology to extract these whole circulating tumor cells, and then we put them on slides and stain them like tissue and have a human pathologist look at it just like they would a tissue biopsy to render a result. Now, when you do that and you have whole intact cells, the accuracy of the test becomes very high, because tumor cells look very, very different than healthy cells. Tumor cells are often much larger, 30, 40 microns instead of 8 or 10. They are multinucleated, multi-headed. They have 5, 6 nuclei instead of 1 or 2. They have what is known as a high NC ratio, which is a nuclear to cytoplasmic ratio. All that means is because they're so heavily nucleated, the nuclei can comprise 85% of the cell instead of 15 or 20. They are hyperchromatic, which means they have too much DNA because they have so many nuclei with so many different genomes with so many different DNA sequences. I mean, these features are so pronounced that my 7-year-old daughter could look at that and tell you that's weird. A board-certified pathologist that spends their life is learning how to examine cells and tissues is not going to mistake a tumor cell for a healthy white blood cell. You're comparing elephants and rabbits.
That's great. So you could detect cancer as early as what they refer to as stage 0. Is that correct?
We can and we have.
Yeah. I'm just trying to familiarize myself with the nomenclature. So stage 0 would be that is the earliest possible stage, but then that's pretty incredible. I mean, right off the start. But if I'm still curious about like the flip side, if someone finds out that they have stage 0 and that, just that C word freaks people out to begin with, and could create a lot of anxiety, but especially if there's if there's not an obvious treatment, or is there for stage 0?
Well, so survival rates at stage 0 are 99%. Okay. So the problem with cancer is they don't catch it early enough, generally speaking. That's the problem. And the way you solve that is screening with a test that can.
Yeah.
And so, let's take an example, like someone like Angelina Jolie. She had some genetic mutations. They're called BRCA1, BRCA2, which increase your risk for cancer.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. BRCA1, BRCA2 positive doesn't mean that you have cancer.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't even mean you'll ever get cancer.
Right. Yeah.
It just means your risk is higher. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
So you can be Angelina Jolie and you can take an extreme intervention like she did, and you can get a double mastectomy.
Yeah.
And I don't fault her for that because, again, cancer is a scary thing, like you just pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's afraid that she won't find it till stage 3, stage 4, at which point it could be fatal. So she wants to preempt it. But if you had a test, as we do, that can detect as early as stage 0, where survival is 99%, you would never take such an extreme intervention. You would just screen regularly to make sure you caught it early.
Well, I got a question for you, Spencer. So has the treatment caught up with this detection? Because a lot of treatment is based off of stage 4 and stage 3. Has the treatment caught up to stage 0?
Yes. So treatments are not based necessarily off the stage. There are certain things you might do that are more aggressive at stage 3, stage 4, which you may not do at an earlier stage cancer, because you don't need to be as aggressive all the time with an earlier stage cancer. So for example, let's assume you have a stage 0 tumor in your breast or your lung, a very small mass. That has not spread regionally, locally into your lymph, regionally into these areas, or certainly not distantly. And so you can treat that locally. You could take focal radiation, and you could treat that spot. You could take lower dose of chemo potentially, and you could treat that. Right? But when you end up with, a stage 3, stage 4 cancer and it's spread all over your body, that's not going to work anymore. Now you end up with full body radiation. Now you end up with lots of heavy systemic chemo. And oftentimes if the cancer doesn't kill you, the chemo will, right? Chemo is highly, highly toxic.
Yeah.
Right? Chemo is nephrotoxic to your kidneys, hepatotoxic to your liver, and immunocompromising, so infections can take over your body and kill you. That's why chemo is so dangerous. But right now, that's what the protocol shows. So these things, the solutions do exist for stage 0, stage 1, stage 2, certainly stage 0 types of cancers, and that's why survival rates when they catch it that early are so high. But again, the issue becomes catching it early. How do you do that consistently and reliably? And how do you do that for all cancers? Today, we only screen for 5 types of cancer. Right? The only screens you have today really are mammogram for breast, pap smear for cervical, colonoscopy for colorectal, PSA for prostate, and lung CT for lung. Now, lung CTs are not generally ordered unless you have 20 years of smoking history, you have a family history. So most people are not getting lung CTs to screen for lung cancer. That's gone generally. Now, depending on your gender, you're not going to do all four.
Mm-hmm.
If you're male, you're not going to do a mammogram and a pap smear. You're just going to do a PSA and colonoscopy. And if you're female, you're not doing a PSA. You're just doing a mammogram for breast, pap smear for cervical, and colonoscopy for colorectal. You're doing nothing for pancreatic, liver, bladder, stomach, gastric, brain, skin, thyroid, adrenal, gallbladder, blah, 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 on and on and on. Most cancers are not even screened for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a problem. Now, one of the things about, and a good example of that is pancreatic, by the way. Like, pancreatic is a presumed death sentence.
Yeah.
Pancreatic cancer is not a death sentence. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer is probably a death sentence. Stage 1 pancreatic cancer is curable.
Mm-hmm.
You'll just never find it.
Yeah.
There's no symptoms. There's no screen. There's no easy diagnostic. The only way they really find it at stage 1 for pancreatic is accidentally.
Yeah.
They're doing a procedure in some adjacent organ, like your liver. They notice an abnormality. They biopsy it. You come out and they go, oh my gosh, we found pancreatic cancer. It doesn't happen often, but when that happens, stage 1 is broken into 1A and 1B. Survival at 1B, even on pancreatic, is 85%. Mm-hmm. Survival at 1A is 92%. Survival at stage 0 is 99%. So if you could reliably find them early, survival rates invert entirely, right? And so one of the things that's important to understand about our test at Cancer Check Labs is that because we are leveraging these CTCs, all tumors must shed to spread fundamentally, period. They have to. That is the fundamental mechanism. And so whether it is coming from your stomach, your liver, your breast, your lungs, your prostate, your colon, whatever the case might be, that tumor is going to shed in order to go from stage 0 to stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, so on and so forth. So when we extract CTCs, those CTCs, interestingly, share certain physical and mechanical characteristics. Size, structure, rigidity, lack of malleability, lack of deformability. They're big, they're hard, they're stiff, they don't bend. Those parameters enable us to selectively extract them during our process. And it turns out that those physical and mechanical characteristics of CTCs are uniform and homogeneous across all solid tumors and their subtypes. As a result, we will capture them indiscriminately, irrespective of source organ, which is what makes our test at Cancer Check Labs a broad spectrum pan-cancer screening. We will catch them whether they're coming from your breast, your lungs, your colon, your brain, your stomach, your pancreas, so on and so forth, because the CTC characteristics from all of them, physically and mechanically, are similar.
This is fascinating because you brought up pancreatic cancer, which is usually found way too late, and the patient, unfortunately dies within a couple months. This could be, revolutionary for, that type of cancer, that there is no early detection. Those people that have had certain cancers in their family or in their, genetic history, do you advise them to get, once a year testing, or what does it depend on the type of history or cancer that they have?
Sure. So you're asking about frequency of testing with Cancer Check Labs. So at Cancer Check Labs, generally I think people are going to try to do it annually. Mm-hmm. But I don't, there's no magical reasons for that other than behavioral training.
Yeah.
People are trained to get annual physicals. People are behaviorally trained to do annual checkups. Like, there's nothing biologically magical about 365 days versus 282 or 417. Sure. Like, it's just training.
Yeah.
And so because of behavior and because of behavioral training, I think people will generally do it every year. Now, with that said, if you have risk factors, to your point, right? If you're a smoker, if you have lifestyle factors, comorbidities, obesity, diabetes, if you have family history or genetic risk, if you have occupational hazard, you're a firefighter, you work at a nuclear power plant, then I think every 6 months, right? You should be more aggressive about screening because your risk is higher.
Yeah. Let me ask you about.
I got something to spend. Just yesterday, I had a patient come in who had some tests come back somewhat abnormal. And the advice he got from his doctor is, we're just going to watch it. And that's like the hose is going and we're just going to let flood until it gets to stage 4 when I know what to do with it. So that's why I was asking the treatment protocols. I told him immediately, well, we need to change and look at like functional medicine and stuff like that to try and rid it. But your lab is almost like we're going to define it even more so we have a plan of knowing what to do with it at an early stage. Am I grasping that correctly?
Yes. I mean, there's 2 parts to this, right? Part A is you have to find it early. Let's start there. You have to find it early for all solid tumors, not just, the 3 or 4 that you're going to screen for, right, today. Part 2 is once you find it, you need to do something. Like this concept of we're going to watch it and we're going to see what happens, I just think is absurd. Like, you have cancer, it's going to spread. Yeah. In fact, the practitioner in this context is saying, we know it's going to get worse, and then we'll just wait till it gets worse to treat it. And, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, it's just irrational in my mind. But so I think like you need to intervene. I think that's also where you're seeing the rise of things like functional medicine, where they're like, you know what, we're not going to wait until this gets, to stage 3, stage 4, it's metastasized through your body. We're going to intervene. Now, there are many physicians and oncologists that will intervene at stage 0, 1, 2. So I don't know who this particular patient is speaking with, and they want to get another opinion because they probably should. But generally speaking, if you have cancer, you want to start making changes, right? Whatever those changes are. And there are things you can do just for your health optimization that can help. Like, one of the things about cancer that a lot of people don't really understand, I get asked this question once in a while of, well, you're looking for these tumor cells in the blood. Doesn't everybody have tumor cells? And so wouldn't everybody be positive?
Yeah.
Well, not exactly.
Interesting.
So it's a very subtle nuance, but it's an important nuance. Mm-hmm. And so we are living biological organisms. As living biological organisms, we constantly have cellular turnover. Old cells die, new cells are formed. Old cells die, new cells are formed. And this cycle continues throughout our life. And so during this cycle, unfortunately, our body makes mistakes sometimes, and it creates erroneous replications of cells, i.e. mutated precancerous cells. Now, the good news is our immune system is very intelligent. Our immune system goes and recognizes those cells and destroys them. And that is why everyone in the world is not dead from cancer right now, or we all would be. Right. And so our immune system is constantly killing these little erroneous replications so that we don't get cancer. Unfortunately, once in a while, for a whole variety of reasons we can discuss, that little erroneous replication will either evade the immune system or the immune system will fail to kill it. And when that happens, that erroneous replication gets a chance to multiply and grow and a tumor is born. Mm-hmm. Once that tumor is born, it's basically base camp. Mm-hmm. That tumor, this is an alien type being. It's literally a mutant. It is a mutated cell that is in your body that wants to now take over more territory. And so it's got its little camp. It's been formed. And now the next thing it does once it's formed, after it's formed, they say, I'm going to find more territory to take over. And it sends out its soldiers, which are little cells from the tumor. Think of them like Vikings going out to sea. And the sea is your bloodstream. And those Vikings are traversing your bloodstream looking for more land and territory to take over, to raid, pillage, and plunder. And so in that territory are your other organs. Look, we found pancreas. Look, we found a liver. Look, we found stomach. We found a brain. And they start expanding, right? They start conquering. They start setting up camp. And those are metastases, secondary and tertiary metastatic lesions. Yeah. And so what's happening is these cells don't start floating through your blood until that tumor is born, which is why with our test, you're not going to detect those CTCs, those circulating tumor cells, unless it's already formed a stage 0 tumor. But, everyone has these sort of things. And so it's important to understand that, because it's the second part of this is our immune system, again, as I just explained, knows how to kill these cells. And so even if you did have an extremely early stage tumor, there are changes you can make in your health to optimize your immune system, right? To immunopotentiate it upwards. Perhaps your immune system was compromised and it failed to kill it. Perhaps your immune system needs a boost, right? There are things you can do that will help it try to even self-resolve the tumor. And that may or may not work, but it may. And so there are ways you can intervene even without getting into the standard protocols, right? Early on. But the notion of just, hey, you have a tumor and we're going to do nothing about it at all. We're just going to hang tight until it gets bigger and it spreads. Like, that's just nuts.
I'm glad you're elaborating on that perspective, because it is, when you mention it, it just sounds so asinine that a doctor would say, hey, let's just wait and watch. Meanwhile, the person has been diagnosed, even with the earliest forms, and they're probably in shock and they want to do something. They want to take action. I think a nice paradigm shift would be to consider, instead of treatment, maybe we should expand on prevention, because people's habits tend to cause, inflammation and immune system compromise and things like that would typically fight those cells, those cancer cells, or any other forms of disease. So I love that we're bringing this up, because this is something that we're shifting the tides and the perspectives of especially in America. Well, let's wait till I'm in pain and agony before I take action on it.
Again, this notion, imagine an analogy. Imagine that you had a skin infection on your finger.
Right.
And the doctor said, we see it, we diagnosed it, we know it's there, but let's wait until it gets to your hand, your arm, and then once your whole arm is infected, we're going to intervene.
Right. We're going to chop it off.
Yeah. Oh, I love this. This is great.
What are you doing?
This is great. I love that we have brought that to light, because, Dr. Terry and I stand strong on preventative measures instead of waiting for, these things to happen and manifest.
Now with prevention, that gets into why is there so much cancer?
Yeah.
Cancer is a huge problem, right? Like, look, 40% of the population will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime. Okay? It actually just went up from 39.5% to 40.5% for the National Cancer Institute.
Doesn't make sense.
And so you're talking about, 4 out of 10 people. And what that represents is 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women. Half of men and a third of women will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime, and it's going up.
Wow.
And so it is a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
In high-income developed countries, several of them, cancer has overtaken heart disease as the number 1 cause of mortality. That data came out in the Lancet in 2019. Mm-hmm. And so this is a massive problem. Yeah. Last year alone, there were 10 million recorded deaths in cancer, and obviously there are more unrecorded. So this is a problem of great scale. It is going to become, and in some places has already become, the number 1 cause of mortality. It continues to increase. Cancer rates in the younger population are rising dramatically. Colorectal cancer rates in people under 55 have doubled in the last 30 years. And so what's going on, right? Like, why is this happening? And what can we do to try to prevent it from happening, slow it down, and hopefully stop it? So there's many things that cause this, right? Number 1, our lifestyles. We're far too sedentary. Yeah.
Yes.
Like, historically, we were hunters and gatherers. We moved. Yeah. We don't move anymore. Sedentary lifestyles lend themselves to metabolic disease. Mm-hmm. Diabetes, obesity, all of which causes inflammation in the body. And inflammation is a breeding ground for that erroneous cellular replication to occur, i.e. a precancerous mutated cell. And so because we have become so sedentary in the last 100, 200 years, and we don't sort of move around the way we used to, we develop more cancer because we develop more erroneous replications. Mm-hmm. Second, we're living longer. It's generally a good thing, but age is a risk factor, because the longer you live, the more cellular turnover you have, the more chances you have to develop an error. Right? And so that's kind of fundamental. Third, we eat too much, and we eat too frequently, right? Our bodies were not designed to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Right.
That is a commercial construct that actually started about 100 years ago in 1916 with the advent of grocery stores, the first one being Piggly Wiggly in Tennessee. And so that was created so we could sell a cereal box, so we could sell later on snack bars, later on microwave meals, packaged foods, but if you look at human history, for the vast, vast majority of human history, we didn't eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? We lived in periods of feast and famine.
Yeah.
You hunted, you caught a buffalo, you ate. You gathered, you ate. You didn't. And those periods of famine were very, very important because during those periods of famine, i.e. fasting, your body triggers certain processes, one of which is critical, which is known as autophagy. And that's auto, self, and phagy, which is Greek for eating, self-eating. And autophagy is critical because that is your body's cleansing process, essentially. When autophagy is triggered, which is triggered in periods of fasting, periods of famine, your body goes out and starts to clean up cells, right? It actually looks for, and contrary to popular belief, opinion, and contrary to what supplement companies and protein powder companies want to sell you, if you don't have a protein shake every 3 hours, your body is not going to go out and start eating up healthy cardiac tissue. That is not what happens, right? That is nonsense. And so what will actually happen is your body is a highly sophisticated biological machine, of which, frankly, we know very little. I would say we understand less than 1% of our biochemistry today. There's so much more to learn that we are just naive in our overall understanding. But we are very sophisticated biological machines. And so when we are in periods of fasting, we're still having that cellular turnover. And as we're having that cellular turnover, we still need to make new cells. In order to make new cells, you need the building blocks of cells, which are amino acids, which come from proteins. And that's why these myths exist, that if you don't eat protein all the time, every 2-3 hours, that your body will start eating up healthy cells. No, your body will actually do the opposite. Your body, being a very sophisticated, intelligent machine, will go out and look for 2 types of cells generally. It will go out and look for cells, or 2 or 3. It'll look for cells that are dysfunctional. Let's say you have bad liver cells from drinking. It'll go, that's not performing. I'm going to destroy that cell. And I'm going to break it down into its base amino acids and reuse those, recycle them, literally, into building healthy cells. 1. 2, your body will look for mutated cells, precancerous cells, and it will go to destroy them more aggressively, thereby reducing the volume of those cells in your body, thereby reducing the risk of developing cancer, which is why fasting is one of the ways you can try to prevent cancer. 3, your body will look for cells that have short telomeres. A telomere is a little strand on a cell that has basically the DNA footprint of that cell. That's the blueprint by which the cell replicates. And what happens as we age is telomeres start to shrink, which is the equivalent of the blueprint fading. And so over time, as they replicate and the blueprint is more faded, the chances of an error increase because you have a faded blueprint, a short telomere. So your body will actually go out during periods of fasting and destroy the cells with shorter telomeres to, again, take those base amino acids, recycle them into healthy cells, which leaves the longer telomere cells, which increases the weighted average of your telomere length, i.e. the fidelity of your blueprint for DNA replication. And when the fidelity of your blueprint for DNA replication is higher, the probability of a correct replication is also higher. The probability of an erroneous replication, i.e. a cancerous cell, is lower. And so your body does all these things. But again, if you sit there and stuff your mouth, breakfast, lunch, dinner, we need a snack between breakfast and lunch. We need our afternoon snack as well. And then I'm going to have a bedtime snack, 6 times a day. You're going to inhibit all these autophagic processes, autophagy in your body, and you're not going to get all these benefits. And so, I think so one is that we got to be less sedentary. We got to move around. 2, we can't do much about the aging thing, but it's there. 3, try to stay healthy, basically. 3, we got to fast. We can't keep stuffing ourselves at the frequency that we do. It just doesn't work. And then the 4th thing is getting into sort of, toxicity. We live in a very toxic environment, like a highly, highly toxic environment. And from everything from the foods that we eat to the products that we use to the air that we breathe to, all kinds of stuff everywhere. I mean, in the US, for example, I think something like 30 years ago, there were 600 food additives that were approved. Today, there's over 10,000. In Europe, there's still 600.
Yeah.
If you go to Europe, I was just in Zurich last year, and it was interesting. I was having breakfast at a hotel, and all the fruit was really small.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
But tasty.
And, the apples are like this big. Over here, they're like this big.
Yeah.
Because they're stuffed with chemicals, hormones, they're stuffed for production. They're sprayed with all kinds of reagents in order to kill pests and this and that. We ingest all of that, right? We ingest those hormones. We ingest those pesticides. We eat those 10,000 food additives, even though we know they're harmful. There was one that was banned a few months ago, red additive. And, that additive, that food coloring, we have known for 30 years is carcinogenic and causes cancer. In fact, it was banned in the US 30 years ago in cosmetics like lipstick because it causes cancer.
Yeah.
But it's allowed as a food additive in Skittles or Starburst or whatever candy needs it to be red. So we allow things here, unfortunately, that we know are dangerous. We allow things to get by. Acne. I was commenting on a story last year where there were acne products, household names, Estee Lauder Clinique, Target Up and Up, Clarisil. These are active products. These are products for acne. Now, the active ingredient in them is benzoyl peroxide. Benzoyl peroxide, fine, except one problem. Benzoyl peroxide is not heat stable. Benzoyl peroxide turns into benzene. Benzene is a highly toxic known carcinogen. In fact, it is so dangerous that the environmental limits, depending on what standard you're talking about for benzene, are 1 to 4 parts per million. These products, when tested in independent labs, were kicking off several hundred to several thousand parts per million of benzene because of the heat instability. That's a problem. When you take that product and you apply it on your skin and you absorb it into your body, you have benzene running through your blood. That is a very toxic chemical that causes cellular damage, causes erroneous precancerous cells, causes cancer. And with something like that, to make matters worse, who's using it? The people that are using it are people that are experiencing a lot of acne, which is basically teenagers going through puberty. What happens during puberty? Well, during puberty, your body surges with growth hormone. What does growth hormone do? It makes stuff grow. Good cells, bad cells, cancer cells, non-cancer cells. It doesn't care. It just makes stuff grow. And so you're going to take this product that has this highly toxic known carcinogen. You're going to stick it into your body at thousands of times the concentration that you should. You're going to create precancerous mutated cells while these kids have growth hormones surging through their blood. What do you think is going to happen? You're going to see increases in cancer rates in the younger population, which is what's happening. And so there's all these factors, from just kind of our lifestyles being too sedentary, causing inflammation, breeding ground for cancer, to eating too frequently, no autophagy, to environmental toxicity from products and foods and air and such. And when you put these things together, especially in a compounding fashion, cancer rates are increasing, and that's why cancer is becoming the number one cause of mortality in the world.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to mention, because in retrospect, some of the things that you said are not only important and valid, and I'm so glad that you are discussing this. We've had several guests in the past that have talked about prevention and doing deep dives into nutrition with testing that most doctors had never heard of before or even bothered doing, except your regular comprehensive metabolic test. There's so much more to identify to help with prevention. Your comment about autophagy is absolutely crucial to understanding. Like when the pandemic of concussion started becoming more evident and pervasive, especially in the NFL, there was one researcher out of UCLA, Mayumi Prinz, who would do studies on Alzheimer's and dementia, and found that eating a ketogenic or even fasting would help accelerate autophagy or prevent it from being interrupted. But what do most parents do when your kid concusses? Oh, little Johnny, let's go to McDonald's drive-through and get you something to eat. And those are like poor fats and proteins and carbs. Whereas a ketogenic diet with good solid fats and protein would help autophagy. So Thank you for bringing that up, because I feel it's so valuable to understand, the mechanisms behind it.
I think the other thing that happens is a lot of people confuse, you brought concussions with potential, but correlation and causation.
Yeah.
Like with concussions, for the assumption, and it was an assumption because of correlation, was that these hard hits that football players have cause concussions and cause brain damage, right? And that's where the brain damage comes from.
Yes.
That is actually not true. What ends up happening is it is all the small little concussive hits where the brain rattles, right? It is not those large hits that are causing them a long-term brain damage. It is the small hits. And the way they figured that out was they did a study on soccer players.
Yeah.
And soccer players had the same rates of brain damage as football players because they're constantly heading the ball. And so, you just have to be careful. Like a lot of people, even with cancer, like there's assumptions that, I know people that do this and they don't get cancer. I know people that do this and they do get cancer. Just there's a lot of caution in making sure that the things are actually causative and not just correlative.
Yeah. All right. I got a question. Let's go back to your cancer check lab and the screen process and how you develop that. A lot of people out there, when they think of screening, one of the tests that they think of, and I know it's kind of a burr in your side, is Cologuard. And the Cologuard goes out there and they talk about pre-screening, yet it only is catching maybe 42-45% of the precancerous cells, and there's a huge false negative or false positive. Can you walk us through your screen? Because it's almost like a cancer dialysis, but can you watch us through your screen process and talk about the pitfalls and how you approach this pre-screen different?
Sure. So in my opinion, Cologuard is not a good test. Start there. And something, first of all, that's only catching 40x% of cancer is missing more than half. That's a problem. The reason Cologuard exists fundamentally is because a lot of people don't comply with colonoscopies. That's it. But it's not because it's a good test. The bar is really low for them to clear in order to get their approvals. Mm-hmm. And so now tests like Cologuard, and there's a whole, in the world of cancer screening, there are categories of tests, right? So first of all, you mentioned Cologuard, isn't catching enough of the cells. Cologuard isn't catching any of the cells, 0. Cologuard is not a cell-based test, right? Cologuard is what's known as a ctDNA, which stands for circulating tumor DNA, sometimes known as cell-free cfDNA-based test. So let me explain what that is. So let's say we talked about how we have tumors, and the tumors shed whole cells, right, that are kind of going through and thous whole cells are little mini-me's. They're micro models from the tumor that are moving around, right? Now, a circulating tumor cell is a biological cell. It's a messed up, mutated, dangerous, aberrant, malignant, cancerous, atypical cell, but it's a cell. It has the components of a cell. It has a nucleus. It has a genome with the DNA sequence. It has cytoplasm, membranes, blah, 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 blah. When that circulating tumor cell is dislodged from the primary tumor, essentially one of 3 things is going to occur in the bloodstream. A, it's going to go through cell apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, where the cell and all its components will break into little bits and pieces and be dispersed into the bloodstream. B, it will get eaten by your white blood cells, like your macrophages that look like a Pac-Man that comes in and crunches it and will literally fracture it and break into little bits and pieces again. Or C, it will traverse your capillaries, where the shear forces, the physical stresses will blow up that cell and fracture it. When any of those events occur, the cell and its components, including the genome, which has the DNA sequence, break into little bits and scraps. So incomplete little scripts and scraps of DNA from that genome start floating around your blood. And those little incomplete scripts and scraps are what are known as circulating tumor DNA, ctDNA. Sometimes they call it cell-free DNA because the cell is gone, so it's freed from the cell. But those scraps are highly incomplete, and they are very, very minimal in their quantity. What tests like Cologuard, Garden Shield, Grail, if you're familiar with, what these tests are trying to do is take these little incomplete scripts and scraps, bits and pieces of DNA, and put them in a black box. And in that black box, apply a set of mystical algorithms. AI, artificial intelligence, ML, machine learning, NGS, next generation sequencing, computational processing, and then extrapolate and guess whether or not we have a tumor cell.
Oof.
The problem is, that's a guess. We don't guess at Cancer Check Labs. We take out the whole cell, so we look at it. We actually know it's a tumor cell. Now, that guess that they do is highly erroneous for a whole bunch of reasons. Number one, they don't have enough signal. They only have little bits and scripts and scraps of this DNA. This is like trying to identify a car with tire scraps. It doesn't work well. Number two, which is why you end up with false negatives, right? Sensitivity is not there. There's not enough signal. So because there's not enough signal, and because they know there's not enough signal, they try to amplify the signal. And they use a technique kind of like PCR. Now, PCR is something that's used to amplify viral organisms. So let's say you get pricked in a hospital and you need a rapid HIV test. Well, there isn't enough viral load. There's enough HIV yet. So they got to amplify it so they can detect it. That's what they use PCR for. That's fine with whole intact viral organisms. DNA scraps are highly, highly unstable. When you try to amplify highly unstable DNA scraps, you will mutate them. So what happens is they have a healthy sample come in. They know they don't have enough signal. They try to amplify the signal. And in that amplification, they mutate the DNA and out comes a false positive. And that's why some of these tests, like Grail, have false positive rates of 56.9%. At which point you are literally better off flipping a coin. You will only be wrong 50% of the time, not 57. So it's just, they suck, like in that regard, right? Like they cannot detect appropriately and properly, in my opinion, because they don't have enough signal, they mutate in their amplification, and there's just a guessing game. You know, the reason that surgical tissue biopsy has always been the gold standard for diagnosis is because they're not guessing. It's actual tissue. It's physical, tangible tissue that they put on a slide. The beauty of what we do at Cancer Check Labs is we figured out how to essentially extract similar homologous cellular tissue from that blood sample. Those cells are the same cells that are dislodged from the tumor. This is actual tissue. You need to follow gold standard methodologies and not guess. Guessing is dangerous. I mean, you know, there are cases, I can see you asked about Cologuard, I can speak to Grail. There's cases that was published last year, you know, where the false positive, I mean, in May of last year, they published data at AACR, Annual American Cancer Research Conference, that they did not want to publish because it was so bad. They were forced to publish it because they recruited participants publicly. Their stage 0 detection rate, this is an example of no signal, is 0. Stage 1, 3%. Stage 2, 5%. Stage 3, 15%. They are missing 85 to 100% of stage 0 to stage 3 cancer. That is useless for an early cancer detection test. And then you crank out false positive rates of 56.9%. That is dangerous. False positives result in unnecessary, costly, and dangerous intervention, surgical tissue biopsies, you know, potentially even treatment at times. And so you have to be cautious. You know, there was a case published in the Atlantic last year with Grail Gallery, this test, where they got a false positive on testicular cancer and they castrated because that's how you biopsy a testicle. Like false positives are very, very dangerous. You cannot have false positives. And that is why we extract these tumor cells. Right? I want to see the cell. I want to make sure that that cell is actually a tumor cell before we return a positive on our screen.
Yeah. So let me ask, are there any, I want to ask you about the next 10 to 20 years and what you see your your company like in the future, Cancer Check Labs. But I also want to ask you, are there any pitfalls that you're constantly trying to avoid? Because no test is obviously perfect, but is there anything that you're still working on to make it even more infallible?
Well, everyone's always trying to optimize the test, right?
Of course,
for sure. I mean, I think one of the things that we want to look at is, right now we talk about screening for 200 plus tumor types because there's 200 major kind of solid tumor types and subtypes. And again, they all follow the same common denominator with the CTCs and physical and mechanical characteristics. But I think we want to start looking even beyond that into more esoteric and rare cancer types. And we actually have had some recent success with that we'll talk about in the future. But we're seeing that we're actually able to detect some extremely rare cancer types as well. And so that's really exciting. That's something to look at. I think more than trying to, beyond the test, we have a good test, but beyond, you always want to optimize. But we have a very good test, an excellent test in fact. And so that's solid. But I think the next step is also what other applications can we do? What are the next phases to this, more so than just trying to continually optimize an already outstanding test? I think the next phase is starting to look at other applications. So for example, we talked a little bit about chemo. Chemo today, one of the reasons that chemo is so toxic is because it's largely blind. If you get diagnosed with cancer, they will put you through 6 to 8 rounds of chemo, often several drugs at a time. That is why it's so toxic, because they don't know what'll work. So they're throwing spaghetti on a wall hoping it'll stick. And that's why oftentimes the chemo kills you if the cancer doesn't, because it's just so toxic. It's too much. And so one of the things that is known about CTCs that has been studied in the past is that because, and this makes sense, because they are cells of the tumor, they have the same response to drugs as the tumor. So if you have the ability to extract them like we do, then before we start chemo, let's inject them with 10, 20, 30, 40 chemo drugs and see what works before you start injecting poison into a human being. That's precision medicine. That's starting to look at, now let's get this down to 2 rounds with a couple drugs as opposed to 8 rounds with 30 or whatever the case might be, right? So there are ways to make these therapies more effective and less toxic, but they require precision. They require insight. And so, thinking about things like that, these same tumor cells that are dislodged from the primary tumor share the same DNA as the primary tumor because they are tumor cells, literally. And so why not take those tumor cells and run a genomic analysis to understand the mutations? That mutational data will guide the design of the most efficacious therapeutic protocol. Is this HER2 positive breast cancer? Use Herceptin and immunotherapy. Is this triple negative breast cancer? Different protocol. Is this high EpCAM lung, low EpCAM lung? Different protocols. Is this MCRP metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer where the V7 receptor is mutated? That will not respond to hormone therapy. Different protocol. Those types of insights based on the genetic alterations are very valuable. One of the problems today is the only way to get that is to cut. You have to do a surgical biopsy. That's fine. They do it in the beginning. They get their data. But here's the thing. Cancer is evolution on steroids. That data is only good for a few months. The tumors evolve. And you can't update it today without going in for another surgical tissue biopsy, which is typically not indicated. Number one, many of these patients are older. They can't sustain so many surgeries. They will have a cardiac event. They will die on the table. Number two, a lot of these patients at that point of time have gone through chemo, radiation, all this stuff. Their bodies are weak. And so you can't just keep cutting them over and over again. So they end up relying on outdated data. If you could extract that data from simply a blood draw, by taking the CTCs that are homologous to the tumor because they're cells of the tumor, you could update it every day. You could update it every week, whatever you want. It's a minimally invasive issue. And so looking at those types of things to kind of further and optimize how therapy should be done.
I love the way you think. Now we're nearing the end, and we have the most fun with something we refer to as the rapid fire questions.
Hey, Spencer, hold on a second. I'm like so hooked on this because my dad died of cancer and I have a lot of cancer. My mother had cancer. We have a lot of functional doctors listening. That's a huge group we have. I'm hooked right now. How do these doctors find your test? How do they use your test? And is it rapidly available for everybody?
Yes. So they go to our website, cancerchecklabs.com. There's a form there if functional practices want to sign up. We work with lots of functional doctors across the country, as you know. And we will onboard them. And the functional doctors will be given a portal. And in that portal, they'll have two options. Option A, if they have a physical clinic location, they'll be able to order kits directly to their location. Option B, if they have telehealth and remote patients, which many functional doctors do, we will drop ship it directly to the patient of theirs in whatever location. We are available today in 47 of 48 continental United States. We're not doing Alaska and Hawaii right now. Logistics are complicated. The only state continentally where we're not, there's 6 states where we need state licenses. California, New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. We have all 5. The last one we're working on right now, where we're close to final steps, is New York, but that's why it's 47 to 48. We are also available in Canada. We are about to launch the UK. We just signed a deal with 140 clinics in the UK that are going to pull blood for us, both fixed phlebotomy as well as mobile phlebotomy, and we're expanding internationally. And so if you want to work with us, if you're anywhere on the globe, we will try to work with you. Just come to the site again, cancerchecklabs.com, sign up. That kit, by the way, that gets drop shipped to our customer, your patient, essentially has everything you need. In that kit are the vials that you need to pull the blood. It is a proper blood draw. It's 40 milliliters of blood. And so I'll get to that in a second. Once the blood is drawn, there's a cooling engine in there, which is very simple. It's a box. The vials go in the box. You put a lid, you hit a button. That button causes a chemical reaction that keeps the sample between 2 to 8 degrees Celsius cold for transport so that it doesn't get spoiled. There is no dry ice handling. There is no refrigeration. There is no centrifugation. There is no ice packs the night before that people forget to do. It is simply a button. Once that's done, in there is also a prepaid FedEx overnight priority label that will overnight it to our lab in Medical District in Dallas the next morning, at which point it will be processed. Now, for blood draw, there's 3 options. Option A, we have partnerships with 4,000 mobile phlebotomists across the country. They will come to your doorstep. They will pull the blood, and they will pack it up. They will take the kit. They will drop it off at FedEx. It takes you 5 minutes. It's white glove. Option B, we have partnership across the country with any lab test now. They have 230 locations across the country. You can walk into one of their locations. They will pull the blood. They will pack it up. They will FedEx it to us. And option 3 is, of course, your practitioner can pull your blood, or your nurse, doctor, whatever you'd like.
That's awesome.
It's fairly
Thank
seamless.
you. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. We are out of time. We had a very informative show. Thank you so much. We probably would have you on again in the future, because it seems that there's constant progress and evolution going on. This is such an important feature and facet, especially with the new progressive government that we have now. So yes. Thank you so much for all your information.
Thank you for having me.
Seeing you again.
Appreciate it.
It's very obvious that your sister would be so proud of you. It's so obvious that your passion is being led by her. And so thank you for Sonia for having a brother like yourself to do this path, because I think a lot of people are going to be saved by both of you.
Thank you. Yeah, if you want, I'll quantify that for you, but sure. I mean, if you think about, look, I told you earlier, last year alone, there were 10 million lives lost in cancer, right? Over the course of 100 years, 100 times 10 million, that's 1 billion lives lost. There are not many things on the planet, that's double-digit percentages of global population. There's not many things on the planet that actively threaten double-digit percentages of global population. If you can detect at stage 0 as early as we can, survival is 99%. You're talking about potentially eradicating that. 1 billion lives potentially saved in 100 years, a short century. I mean, to put that in perspective, if you were to add up all fatalities from all wars in human history, the total is 350 million. It's, you're talking about an impact that's 3 times of that in just 100 years, potentially. And so it's just a massive, massive thing for the world and humanity. And it's important that we get it out there.
Well, we're going to do our part. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate you guys having me.
You got it.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Crackin Backs Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you follow us on Instagram at Crackin Backs Podcast. Catch new episodes every Monday. See you next time.